If I told you that I had a story involving North Korea trying to interfere with American elections and neighbors that became axe murderers over the trimming of a tree, and that the story got bigger from there, you would think that I was talking about a uniquely 21st century incident. But no, this all happened in 1976. And this is the story of Operation Paul Bunyan. I know it sounds like it should be a bunch of lumberjacks fighting against each other or something, but it's not. It is, in fact, a very real example of an episode from the Cold War. And it's probably something that you would never have heard of unless you're into, studying really weird things, like how close did we actually come to nuclear war over a tree? So, let's go back and let's set the scene, shall we? It's 1976 in the Korean Demilitarized Zone, which is really weirdly named because, sure, there's no military in that zone between North and South Korea, but it's not like they don't have guns trained on that area to make sure that nobody crosses illegally, right? Try being a North Korean just skipping across on over to South Korea and see how demilitarized it actually is. But this is a place that separates North Korea from South Korea. It was created after the Korean War when everyone was just sort of tired of fighting. They're all like, yeah, okay, sure. Let's put a heavily militarized line between us and see what happens from there. That should stop things from boiling over, right? Spoiler alert. Nothing good ever happens when you've got enemies facing each other, separated by only a few feet of barbed wire in a trench. So, on August 18th of 1976, we've got this little group of Americans and South Korean soldiers that are posted at what is known as the Bridge of No Return. Now, it's called the Bridge of No Return because after the Korean War, that was where the soldiers would be exchanged, the prisoners of war. They would meet in the middle and make their exchange. It's the only place along the entire demilitarized zone where North Korean soldiers and South Korean soldiers would stand face to face. It was called the Bridge of No Return because captured soldiers would be given the choice to either stay in the country where they had been captured or they could return to their homeland. But once they returned home, they were not allowed to come back. It was no return, like the name says. Now, all summer long, things had been heating up between North Korea and South Korea and the American allies. North Koreans had been trying to keep Americans from accessing some islands off of the Korean peninsula, and they knew that they didn't own those islands, but they said that they might not have a right to keep Americans from the islands, but they own the waters around the islands, and so that was their jurisdiction. That was their justification. The Americans urged South Korea to contest this little They have this little hotline that they have to North Korea, and in the meantime, they started doing reconnaissance missions to see what North Korea was doing, if they were building forces. North Korea said that this was a hostile act, and they said that the U.S. was trying to start a war. That was in May of 1975. In the spring of 1976, North Korea started to broadcast propaganda every day, saying that the U.S. was committing acts of aggression and that they were trying to start a war. Finally, on August 5th, there was a shootout between North and South Korean soldiers in the demilitarized zone. North Korea said that it was all the U.S. introducing new weapons Korean peninsula, that they were attempting to start stuff. And at the same time, Washington had also found out that North Korea was trying to influence the upcoming elections. North Korea figured that if there had been American casualties in South Korea, then Americans would want to pull out of the area. So, suffice it to say, things were getting pretty tense out there in the demilitarized zone in the summer of 1976. Okay, so now, back to the Bridge of No Return. At either end of the Bridge of No Return is a little post. One on the North Korean side, one on the South Korean side. And as I said, tensions had been escalating throughout the summer. So now the North Koreans were known to occasionally sneak across that bridge and try to grab an American or a South Korean soldier and drag them back to North Korea. At some point, at one point, the North Korean soldiers actually did hold a group of U.S. troops at gunpoint in the Joint Security Area near the Bridge of No Return. A company commander of the Joint Security Force named Captain Arthur Boniface was sent to make the North Koreans stand down and bring these Americans back to where they belonged. And he did. He did. So the North Korean soldiers in the area were very well familiar with Captain Arthur Boniface and also his South Korean counterpart, Captain Kim. The two captains never wore sidearms because as members of the Joint Security Area, they were only allowed to have 5 armed officers and 30 armed enlisted personnel at any time. Another thing you'll need to know is that the South Korean outpost is surrounded by trees. It was only visible to the other United Nations command checkpoints during the winter when the leaves had fallen. So, of course, that's a problem. That's a security risk. There was another security risk in the form of a poplar tree that blocked the line of sight between the United Nations Command's checkpoint and the observation post on the South Korean side of that Bridge of No Return. So the tree is located in that jointly controlled zone. So Americans tell the North Koreans, hey, we're going to have to trim back this tree, right? And the North Koreans are all like, no, can't do that. See, that was planted by our supreme leader, Kim Il-sung, who was the grandfather of North Korea's current leader, Kim Jong-un. Captain Boniface is like, okay, fine, sure. We'll take care of it ourselves. And he gets First Lieutenant Mark Barrett and 11 other enlisted men, both American and South Korean, and the South Korean captain, Captain Kim. And they all go down there. They're ready to do their landscaping, right? They got their ladders, they got their axes, they got their elbow grease, and they are good to go for about 15 minutes. They go, they chop along. No problems, no troubles in the world, right? And then a group of North Korean soldiers, led by a guy named Lieutenant Pak-chul, who was called the Bulldog, because he used to get into a lot of confrontations, he comes by and starts shouting at the Americans, accusing them of violating North Korean territory, even though this is a jointly controlled zone. I'm sure you could just see the Americans eye-rolling at them. And then Pak-chul orders his soldiers to attack. They had come down with crowbars and clubs. And when the Americans, who were surprised by the sudden violence, dropped their axes, the North Koreans also had axes to beat them down with. It only lasted no more than 20 to 30 seconds. But by the end of it, Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett had been axed. Boniface was dead. Lieutenant Barrett managed to get himself over a low wall and dropped into a 15-foot deep depression that was just across from the road. It wasn't visible from the road because of all the dense grass and, of course, the aforementioned trees, so he just lay there, waiting to be found. As the North Koreans scurried back to their own post, taking Boniface's body with them. The United Nations Command Force, who had been watching the area, started to realize that the North Korean grounds at their post started to act a little sketchy. One would go down with an axe into that depression, and a few minutes later he would come back up and hand that axe to another guard, who would go back down and come back up a few minutes later and hand that axe off to another guard, who went back down. That all went on for about 90 minutes. They watched until they learned from the outpost what had happened, and that Barrett was missing. So they sent out a search and rescue squad. They did recover him alive, but he died on the way to the hospital. Of course, North Korean propaganda came out almost immediately saying that the Americans had sent in 14 soldiers with their axes to cut down the tree of their own accord, and it was something that was supposed to be mutually consented to beforehand. They said that the Americans had attacked the North Koreans when North Koreans had just gone down there to tell them that what they were doing was against the rules. And they said, despite us being outnumbered, we managed to overcome them in self-defense. Real underdog story there. Except they weren't actually outnumbered. It was like 16 North Koreans to 14 American and South Koreans. But maybe that part was just a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy. Because they were about to be outnumbered by a lot. I mean, like, a lot. Now, America didn't want to wage war officially against North Korea, right? This was the height of the Cold War, and doing something like that would have escalated things. So they can't wage war against North Korea. But they can wage war against a tree in the demilitarized zone. And thus, Operation Paul Bunyan was born, named after the American legendary folk hero who could chop down trees like a kid can knock over popsicle sticks. Operation Paul Bunyan was planned as the most over-the-top, testosterone-filled, absolutely kick-ass response to an international incident ever devised, all to finish trimming down that goddamn tree. So, on August 21st, 1976, 3 days after the axe murder incident, they sent out 16 engineers, with chainsaws this time, to do the actual tree cutting part. But these guys were not your mama's landscapers. They were backed by a force of 813 men, including South Korean soldiers with M16 rifles and grenade launchers, and a massive show of force on standby just in case North Korea got any funny ideas. They had attack helicopters, they had fighter jets, they had B-52 bombers, they had nuclear-capable bombers ready to roll. The U.S. Midway, an aircraft carrier, was just sitting offshore, just in case anyone needed a little extra convincing. Oh, and they had 12,000 other troops stationed nearby, just hanging out with artillery units and tanks. Because apparently when you're cutting down a tree in the demilitarized zone, you need enough firepower to take over a small country. But there was more. Oh, there was more. In the air, they had F-4 Phantom jets, providing cover just in case North Korea decided to go all full axe-wielding maniac again. And if that wasn't enough, the South Korean Special Forces were deployed. Now, they were armed with clubs, and they are well trained in Taekwondo. And they're supposed to be unarmed, but in this particular instance, they parked their truck near the Bridge of No Return, and they started throwing out sandbags that had lined the truck bottoms, and then they started handing out M16s, and they started handing out grenade launchers, and they've got claymore mines strapped to their chests with firing mechanisms in their hands. They're going hard, shouting at the North Koreans. And now, I've got to tell you, these guys have two mottos, right? One is make impossible possible, which is very Disney of them. I approve. I like it. But the other is approach like a ghost, strike like thunder, vanish like smoke. So cool. But also, I don't know that this reached that level of approach like a ghost, because, I mean, it was pretty bold and obvious. Still, I can't fault them. I kind of like them, you know. Okay, so, now, all of this show of force did work. They went in, they cut down the tree. 45 minutes later, the tree is gone, reduced to a stump. They didn't just prune it. It was beyond pruning. This was a stump now. And it also, like I said, took 45 minutes, which kind of maths out to be about one soldier for every 3 seconds of tree trimming. But hey, mission accomplished, right? After the tree was cut down, North Korea got really polite. Having seen South Korea mobilize half their military to deal with a poplar tree, they weren't going to screw around. Kim Il-sung, the supreme leader of North Korea at the time, sent a message through diplomatic channels expressing regret over the incident. Now, let's be clear, that wasn't exactly an apology. But in the world of Cold War diplomacy, that was probably as close as you're going to get to a my bad. The crisis over the tree in the middle of the demilitarized zone was averted without a single shot fired at that point. I mean, that's not to say it was bloodless. There was, axes wielded. But what did we learn from all of this? Well, for one, never underestimate the power of absurdity in diplomacy. Sometimes a show of force so ridiculous and so unnecessary actually works, because nobody's really sure what to make of it. I mean, can you imagine being in Pyongyang, watching U.S. forces roll in like they're about to storm the beaches of Normandy, only to find out that they're just here to cut down a tree? I bet you'd start second-guessing your entire approach to foreign policy. Secondly, it's a testament to how absurdly insane the Cold War was. Everyone was so on edge, so ready to assume that World War III was upon us, that something as innocuous as trimming a tree very nearly triggered a full-blown military confrontation between nuclear-armed nations. Well, I mean, kinda. Okay, like North Korea's nuclear weapons program didn't really start until the 80s, but I mean, they had nuclear research, and they had the Soviet Union. But finally, Operation Paul Bunyan highlights the kind of surreal nature of life in the demilitarized zone. Even today, it's a place where tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife. or, an axe. That too soon? Is it too soon? I don't know. Anyway, the Korean War was never technically ended, and the demilitarized zone stands as this bizarre reminder that sometimes a conflict can go indefinitely paused in time, punctuated by occasionally weird moments like this. Operation Paul Bunyan, in the end, it wasn't just about chopping down a tree. Obviously, it was a statement. It was a very loud, very ridiculous statement. That said, the stump was left standing as a reminder. Well, until it was replaced by a monument in 1987. The security area's advanced camp is now called Camp Boniface in honor of the slain commander. And he was later returned to the Americans and buried at West Point, where he went to school. The axe that was used in the incident is now being displayed in the North Korean Peace Museum, supposedly. I mean, supposedly. It's supposedly that axe. After the incident, in order to prevent further conflicts like this, the North Korean and South Korean sides went to their separate corners within the joint security area, and on the South Korean side, at least, the Bridge of No Return is now a tourist destination. Looking back at the whole thing, it really does seem like a symbol, both of the absurdity of the Cold War and the unpredictability of life in the Korean Peninsula. There's something almost poetic about a lone tree standing in one of the most heavily guarded places on Earth, causing an international crisis just because it was in the wrong place at the wrong time and growing leaves. Operation Paul Bunyan remains a weird footnote in history. This strange reminder that sometimes the best way to avoid war is to mobilize for one over what might seem like the silliest thing imaginable. It is darkly humorous, a testament to the lengths humans will go to prove a point, even if that point involves enough military firepower to level a continent, all to chop down a tree.